Pope is the boss of it all.
Good, okay. So Papal Italy is going to be the big country in Western Europe. So after Charlemagne's empire collapses, after his son Louis the Pious dies. Louis the Pious dies in 840, and Louis the Pious has 3 sons that partition Charlemagne's empire. So at this point, the French Empire is no longer one empire. So what ends up happening is after, say, 840, what's Spain? Spain's been conquered by the Muslims. The French Empire of Charlemagne that has essentially guaranteed the security of the church to operate has now been partitioned. Germany is still not fully evangelized. England's been raided by Vikings. Right? The only country that's left in the western half of the Roman Empire that's still standing is Papal Italy, because Pepin, Charlemagne's father, had conquered parts of Italy and donated the land to the church. So one of the issues here is that the only country that's left standing in Western Europe is Papal Italy, where the Bishop of Rome is now has double duty as King of Italy. So this means that, so one of the things it's going to result in is papal elections are now going to be a lot about who's going to be the best person to keep Italy afloat, rather than necessarily who is the most spiritual bishop. And I mean, I don't want to make excuses here, but for like the corruption that's happening in the 800s and 900s, but this is a very, very rough period of time. Politics is extremely cutthroat. I talked a little bit yesterday about how there were different Italian families, different political factions. And if the government of Italy is the papal government, and that's the only government in town, then what are you going to try to do? You're going to try to get your relatives and your political allies to become priests and bishops so that you can get special interest benefits from the church. All right?
Can I ask?
Sure.
One
Feel free to ask.
brain cramp that I have. I
Sure.
keep thinking about the infallibility of the Pope, and here
Yes.
we have these people that are not leading. But if I remember what you were saying last week, is I can still have faith in my church because those popes didn't make big declarations. You said that changed things.
Yeah,
So therefore, the infallibility idea could still exist.
Yeah.
Maybe.
When we're talking about papal infallibility, what we're talking about is with regard to doctrines on faith and morals, when the Pope is acting as the final authority on a doctrinal issue or on an issue of morality. So what we have during this time period is people are very unwilling to consult the popes on issues of doctrine and morals.
I can understand.
For obvious reasons.
Right. Right.
So the good thing here about papal infallibility is that during this time period, there is a drop in the number of theological and spiritual decisions being made by the popes. Few people are actually referring these decisions to the bishops of Rome. And when they do refer these decisions to the bishops of Rome are either saying, well, they pass the buck. They often pass the buck on things that popes should not be passing the buck on. Nevertheless, they're passing the buck. They're not actually making a decision that contradicts what the apostles teach. So you could say papal infallibility here is preserved by default. Right? The doctrine of the church is preserved by default because these guys are not issuing lots of theological decisions. And people are unwilling to refer theological decisions to the Pope because of the contentious political situations that are going on. And the few decisions that are being referred to the popes, oftentimes they're decided, but what the Pope will say is just be like, yeah, whatever, stick with whatever was said before. I don't know anything about this topic. I'm more concerned about raising an army to keep the Muslims from invading Italy. I'm much more of a warrior pope, if you will. You know, I'm not too concerned. I don't know anything about theology. Just stick with whatever you did last.
Okay.
Right. So that's sort of the upside to this on the papal corruption. When we're talking about papal corruption, what we're talking about is passing the buck on things that popes should not be passing the buck on, and thus problems are getting worse over time because there's not a whole lot of decisions being made on theological issues. Or you're talking about popes that, the scandal is that they don't really know a whole lot about theology because they're elected pope because of their political connections. And as a result, they're just like, yeah, whatever, stick with whatever was done before, regardless of whether or not something needed to be reformed. Yes?
Did this result in any divisioning or local autonomy or whatever issues that, rather than having a central decision maker?
So one of the things that's going to happen is at this time there is what historians sort of describe this period of time in church history as there was an inside the Beltway way of thinking about things that was sort of say in Italy, and then there was an outside the Beltway way of thinking about things, which is these guys right here. Now the Gregorian reform is basically going to be taking the outside the Beltway elements and bringing them inside the Beltway. Bob, you had your hand up. Okay. So as I mentioned before, Papal Italy from the 850s to say the 1000s. Papal Italy is the only organized Christian kingdom in Western Europe, and this, of course, creates political problems or political issues in the church because you've got popes being elected not because of their great spiritualness, not because of their great knowledge of theology, but because they're good at raising tax revenue, they're good at getting political deals done. Now, in some ways, this is good. These guys had a lot of political accomplishments. These guys were able to get European principalities to agree to the Truce of God, which was the largest limitation on war, like, known until I hesitate to say ever. If it had, it's one of the greatest agreements ever on the limitation of war happened during this time period. Why? Because these guys were really good politicians. Right? These guys were able to evangelize Slavic peoples. Right? The Poles come into the church during this time period because of contacts with the Bishop of Rome. Not because of contact with anybody else, because of the Bishop of Rome. Well, wait a minute, why are they so willing to come into the church and talk with people corruption? Well, because bishops of Rome at this time were very good at helping them resolve their political situations, political problems. Right? Hungary comes into the church during this time period. Right? The Czechs come into the Saint Wenceslaus, of the Czech Republic. Right? He is the king that comes into the church during this time period and brings the Czechs with him. So these Slavic tribes are now entering in, and these Slavic tribes are coming into the church during this time. Right? The Russians convert to Christianity during this period of time. All right, so there's lots of Slavic peoples converting to Christianity, in spite of the fact that people inside the Beltway are like, oh, well, those popes, they're political guys. So that's happening inside the Beltway. We kind of talked about that last class. What's happening outside the Beltway? First off, Benedictines. If you go to this sheet here, the first sheet on the handout, this is a sort of it's a list of, or it's a map here of all of the major Benedictine monasteries in Europe at the time. If you remember, the Benedictines were founded by Saint Benedict to mitigate the fall of the Roman Empire, to try to find a way of helping Christianity survive after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the most important of these monasteries was Cluny in France. Cluny stood until the French Revolution. The monastery was destroyed and burned to the ground, and all of its contents destroyed during the French Revolution. Thank you, Reign of Terror. The other most important monasteries were Gortz and Saint Blaise. So there's this incredibly dense network of Benedictine monasteries that are, shall we say, outside of Italy, outside the Beltway. And one of the big things for the Benedictines here was that Benedictine monasteries operated outside of authority from bishops. The abbots of a monastery was basically their own bishop. And abbots of monasteries were not installed by local bishops or by popes. What is good about this, given the political situation here in Western Europe?
More corrupt.
Okay. This is where we start getting a division between what we call religious priests now and diocesan or secular priests. So, in the 800s and 900s, you had this idea basically where if you were called to the religious life, and you were called to the religious life because you wanted to escape from worldly affairs, people assumed that meant you were called to be a Benedictine. So there was sort of like this firewall for monasteries. You went out of your way to try to avoid bringing concerns of the outside world into a monastery. Now, if you thought that you were called to be a priest that helped people with their daily lives, that usually meant you were called to be a secular priest or a diocesan. And it was the diocesans that were approved by popes, appointed by popes, and things like this. Right, so if there is papal corruption, that is affecting the diocesan clergy at this time. It's not really affecting guys living off there in monasteries too much. There's sort of this firewall in place for those guys. Because those Benedictines aren't really giving you political problems, they're not really giving you political opposition, they're trying to escape from the world. Right, so why mess with them? So what's going to happen is, outside of Italy, who are people looking to for leadership in the case of papal corruption? They're looking to their local Benedictine monastery for leadership. Like local abbots essentially become treated as though they were the diocesan bishops. So part of the Gregorian reform is going to be bringing Benedictines outside of the monastery and saying, well, we can trust you guys. Congratulations, you're now the bishop. Or, you know, we need some better cardinals. We need some cardinals that are not members of Italian political factions. Where are we going to get these guys? Benedictines, congratulations, you are now cardinals. We want you guys to vote on the next pope. So that's one linchpin of Gregorian reform, of bringing outside the Beltway ideas into the Beltway, essentially. Another way of doing this, the second most important group here for kickstarting the Gregorian reforms, are the kings of Germany. As I mentioned before, in the 850s, when Louis the Pious's empire falls, Germany is not fully evangelized at this point. Like Charlemagne's empire included parts of Germany, but the evangelization of Germany is still ongoing. Now, finally, by 936, you have the first organized kingdom of Germany coming together under Emperor Otto I. This is what Germans refer to as the First Reich, or as Hitler would refer to as the First Reich, the First Empire of Germany. Under Otto I for 936, and he reigns from 936 to 962. And he sort of jumpstarts a reform of the church structures in Germany. So the Benedictines here are sort of firewalled from the papal corruption. They're mostly in France and Germany. And then you've got Otto I here starting in the 900s that's launching this reform of the German church. Why would the German Empire, why would the German emperor want to launch a reform of the German church? What would be his value added or gain from this? Yes?
His gain would be eliminating opposition.
How so?
Well, because they were all political in the secular priest side, and this would quell that.
Okay, so number one, if you are Otto I, and you're afraid that your clergy are too political, and you might have opposition as a result of this, well, maybe my clergy should be more like the Benedictines. Maybe my clergy should be more concerned about spiritual and theological things than about politics. And there's a political gain in this for me. Right? So that's one reason. There are two other things that are also plausible that historians have tried to point to. So that's one. So there's political gain for him in this. Why else would this be a political gain for the German emperor? Yeah.
Would it allow him to kind of assimilate everybody into one kingship?
Okay, so it's going to consolidate his power if the church is united, if the clerical officials are on the same page and they're working with him. Why would it be so important for a king in the 900s to be able to have the clergy working with him?
Because the clergy is the one that's most in contact with the population.
Okay, so notice here, if you have connections to the clergy,
connections to the people.
You can, well, why? Because every town's got a church. So if I have good relations with my clergy, I can disseminate my material quicker because the clergy will basically have no problem disseminating my information, right? I'll be able to, collect more intelligence on the local town. It's not like I've got a police force. It's not like I have internet. It's not like I have phone calls, airmail letters, or things like that, right? The clergy is my way of knowing what's going on in each of those towns. And who are in the 900s, who gets a formal education? Priests and clergy. So if I want the best and brightest in my administration, I need the clergy. What if I can't trust the best and brightest? That's a problem for me. So what I need to do is I need the best and brightest to be very moral so I can trust them. How am I going to make the best and brightest who are clergy more moral? Well, reform. Moral reform of the clergy. And there's a third thing here that people say this is very altruistic, but in the 900s, if you want to be popular with the common man, it's sort of an opposite way we think about it today, right? It's you didn't become popular. If you wanted to generate popular enthusiasm, you did not do it by saying, "Well, I've got some really good tax policy, and I'm going to leave you alone." Right? That's not how you did it. If you wanted to show that you were a good king that cared about your people,
You went to church.
you had to show them that you cared about their souls. Because your souls are eternal and your bodies are temporary. If I only show you that if I just care about, your body and your tax policy and your stuff in your pocket, then I'm actually disrespecting you. Because I'm only treating you as, I'm only valuing your material body. What your body can do for me. I'm not concerned about your eternal destiny. How heartless is that? Right, so in the 900s and 1000s, one of the ways that the population judged you as being a good king was not economics stuff. They judged you as being a good king based on whether or not
You good monasteries.
you cared for their souls by building the monasteries, by reforming the clergy, by doing things like this.
And that caring could be genuine, too.
Yeah, that care could be genuine, right? It's, so it could be cynical, it could be genuine, right? So there are three reasons why Emperor Otto I, there are at least three reasons here why Otto I would want to launch a major reform of the German clergy. So what Otto does is he says, okay, I'm going to take these Benedictine monasteries that are in Germany, and I'm going to convince Benedictines to come become bishops, and the Benedictines will be my political advisors. And this will have a top-down effect on the people. Right, so the Benedictines were sort of firewalled. I'll take the guys from outside the firewall. I'll put them in bishop positions. I'll make them my political advisors rather than these other people who are products of political factions. Henry III. So by the time his, great-grandson here, Henry III becomes king from 1039 to 1056, Henry III decides that the church in Germany is right where it needs to be. Outside the Beltway is going strong. Inside the Beltway needs a little what's going on in Germany. So what Henry III does is he rides down into Italy, and he starts convincing, sometimes by positive incentives, and sometimes by negative incentives. Whenever there's an open position in the Vatican, they'll go down and be like, you know what? I've got this great German bishop lined up for you. Oh, there's an opening for cardinals? You're having a consistory. Well, I have some great German bishop recommendations for you for cardinals. Right? So this sort of happens, Otto is doing a little bit of that. Henry III starts doing that in droves. So there's sort of a ramp up here from Otto I solidifying the German church to people after Otto I trying to stick their toe down there in Italy, and Henry III is like, that's it, I'm taking the show to Italy. And then in the 1150s you get mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans contributing to the Gregorian reform. The Dominicans, of course, everyone know what's a mendicant order?
Preachers.
What?
Preachers.
Teachers.
But that would be an example. Preachers.
Teachers.
Okay, teachers perhaps.
The ones that do without things.
Ah, yes, okay, good. So a mendicant, yes, what? Bring us on. Okay. So yeah, so a mendicant religious order here is an order that takes a very absolute vow of poverty, right? They take sort of extra strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So the idea was that the Dominicans here are order founded by Saint Dominic. One of their big things is intellectual reform. Thomas Aquinas, for example, is a Dominican. The Franciscans, their goal is spiritual reform of the people of the clergy. St. Francis of Assisi. Right, so both of these guys, so they decide that these orders here decide that they're only going to operate based on donations. Right, and donations up to a certain point. So these two groups here were considered like the untouchables. And they spring up about maybe halfway through the Gregorian Reform. So if the age of the Gregorian Reform starts around 1000, and it ends around 1300. These guys come about in the 1150s to sort of augment and spur it on even further. But the genesis of the Gregorian Reform is the Benedictines working with these kings of Germany, and the Benedictines and the kings of Germany coming to Rome. So, what kinds of reforms are we talking about here? There seemed to have been amongst the Gregorian reformers a sort of hierarchy of reforms that needed to happen, with number 1 being the most important, and then once you got to 1, you go to 2, you go to 3, you go to 4, and then number 5 would of course be the thing that you do once everything else was in order. So the Gregorian reformers wanted to reform spiritual things, in particular practices. Right, in the 800s and 900s, you started to have what was called simony. Simony was, of course, simony meant that you would get your office, you'd get your appointment by bribery, essentially. Right, so you would say, okay, well, there's an opening for bishop. I want a legitimate bishop ordination. How much is it going to cost? So it's not that these guys didn't have apostolic succession. They paid very well for getting apostolic succession to be bishops and cardinals and things like this. Another issue was called pluralism. Right, pluralism meant that you held multiple church offices at the same time. This was a big thing amongst the political factions because, because again, the church was not only the prime mover of education, it was the prime mover of the economy, it was the prime mover of, like, healthcare and lots of other things. So if you had your guy controlling a monastery, and also being a bishop, and also being the governor of something, then you would hold these multiple offices, and you would have, like, your party would have control of a particular region. So these guys want to stop simony, the reformers want to stop simony, they want to stop pluralism. Another issue was clerical concubinage. Clerical concubinage. Concubines.
Oh, really?
So the issue here was that if you were in some places, right, if you were a good enough political administrator, your cardinal or your pope might look the other way if you were not keeping your vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Because it's slim pickings for good administrators in the 800s and 900s as it is. Right, again, Italy's the only country in Western Europe organized and left standing. So beggars can't be choosers if you've got a good administrator. Right, if you've got someone with good tax policy who's good at training the local militia against Muslim assaults, then you might look the other way on his vow of chastity. Yes?
This is a little bit, just backing up. Put this on the timeline of Middle Ages, Renaissance, where are we?
Okay, so so the Renaissance begins in the mid-1300s.
Okay.
So we are before the Renaissance. We are, this is about the beginning of the High Middle Ages and then ending at the High Middle Ages. All right, so at this point we're about 500 years after the fall of Rome. All right, we're about 200 years after Charlemagne's death.
So, were there still the feudal systems in these countries? I mean, how were people?
Yeah, the feudal system is becoming solidified during this time period.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So you have this going on. We also have what's called lay investiture. Lay investiture means that lay people appointing clerical people to offices. So let's say I'm in northern Germany. Communications with Rome might be kind of difficult. So I might just say, look, local prince, can I be the bishop? Yeah, okay, you can be the bishop. Right, because who has the coercive power up in northern Germany? Well, your local prince does. Who's going to tell them no?
And they do that in China now.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, well, that's actually one of the arguments the Chinese make is, well, in the 900s, this was common practice in Europe. And we're like, yes, and we fought a whole reform movement over this. And then, of course, heresy. Where have most of the major heresies begun in the last 700 years? Where have they been? Not in the western half, because they've been the barbarians. Where have they been happening? In the Greek East. So if you're the reformers, if you're the Gregorian reformers, and you want to crack down on heresy, you're going to have to reassert authority over there in the Greek East at some point. Intellectual reforms. So there were two major intellectual movements here. One, of course, was the growth of universities. Most universities at this time were either in origin or in practice attached to Benedictine monasteries. So university usually meant you're living with monks. Not so much today. Also, so they wanted to increase the number of universities. They wanted to make it easier for people to go to university. The other aspect of the reform here was the Inquisition, and the Dominicans would eventually be given control over the Inquisition. Dominicans, okay. So the Inquisition was founded for two reasons. One, it was founded to give more unbiased legal decisions than you would get from your local feudal lord. Because you'd have 3 highly educated priests going from town to town who were not locals, so they did not have, they were sort of considered less biased. These guys take the Dominicans, they take the super vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, so they're harder to bribe than your local feudal lords might be. And they would go from town to town, they'd sit up, so these Dominicans would operate in groups of 3s, they'd go from town to town, they'd resolve any legal disputes that you didn't want to take to the feudal lord, and it would be a way of bringing a university-level education to small towns, for 3 weeks at a time. So that was sort of the Inquisition. The Inquisition gets founded by Pope Innocent III here in the early 1200s as sort of a crowning achievement of the Gregorian reforms. One of the reasons why people are going to hate the Inquisition so much in the 1400s is that these guys become corrupted themselves during the Renaissance for a variety of reasons. And this was so bad because these were the untouchable guys during the Gregorian reform. This was the Inquisition was put in during the height of the Gregorian reform. If even the Inquisition goes south, what's the state of the church in the Renaissance? Right. Political reforms. They want to go after Caesaropapism. So once again, this is Caesaropapism, and this is also lay investiture. So the idea here is we want the clergy to have less direct influence on political affairs. We don't want a bishop to be doubling as the governor of a certain region. And we don't want clergy getting their offices from political figures. We don't want a king or an emperor or a governor saying, congratulations, you're now the bishop of somewhere. So they want to crack down on Caesaropapism. Where is Caesaropapism most prevalent? In the Greek East. So again, you're going to have to lay down the law to those Greeks at some point. And lay investiture. You want to, as much as you like the kings of Germany jump-starting the reform, this is the kings of Germany. They're appointing good bishops, but they're still appointing bishops. So for lay investiture, eventually you're going to have to say, German kings, thanks for getting this whole reform movement started. It's time for you to stop. German kings may not like that too much. Right? So eventually what the reformers are going to say with politics is what they're going to say is that the clergy are not to hold political offices unless they're granted a papal exception and the burden of proof is on the political figure that wants to appoint them to prove that they're the only qualified person. All right, so this is what the Gregorian reformers eventually say, is that, okay, fine, clergy can serve as political advisors, but if you want them to actually double up and hold a political office, they need to have special papal approval, and you have to prove that no one else is more qualified. This is part of the lay investiture controversy. Once you've got those three, we're going to try to reform the Greek East. We're going to try to lay down the law to those Greeks where all the heresies are happening and all of the Caesaropapism is happening. And when we get that straightened out, we can then have a coherent strategy to defend against Muslim attacks. This is sort of the agenda. So when we talk about the Gregorian reform, we're talking about this agenda here. Spiritual reform of practices, stopping heresies, increasing intellectual development and reform, reforming the way in which the clergy engage in politics. They can act only as advisors unless there are special circumstances that the Pope gives an exception on. We're going to try to reestablish contacts with the Greek East and reform the Greek East. And then we're going to try to develop a coherent, organized strategy against Muslim aggression. Yes?
This is also the time period where a lot of the great cathedrals were being constructed.
Absolutely. Want me to go into that a little bit?
Yeah,
Yeah, so a lot of the big cathedrals that we know of today from Europe, a lot of the big famous ones, they're being built, 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I guess first of all, you might say, well, why build such large and impressive churches? Given your limited resources, why wouldn't you just build something more humble? The reasoning that most people used during this time period was, think about it like this, right? When someone walks into town, you want them to notice. You want them to notice right away what what your town values, right? If the town bar is the thing that is noticed the most, then that is an indicator of what the people value the most. Mm-hmm. But if the church is what you notice first, that tells you what the people's values are. So you want the church to be the most impressive structure in town. Number one. Number two, you want the church to be so big and impressive that when you walk into it, you will get the impression that you are in a particularly special and holy place that is different from any other place that you might be any other day, at any other place, any other day. So the idea was you wanted to walk into that church and say, holy crap, what happens outside of this does not matter at all when compared with what happens in here. Mm-hmm. So those churches were intentionally built to overawe people when they walk in, so that you would walk in and be like, wow. This really is the most important thing.
It still happens.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone's watched Father Barron's Catholicism series, that's why he's going into all those churches, right? Yes?
This also was a very strong educational tool because the stained glass work in there was for that purpose, to teach the people who could not read.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to have walls that are big enough to have tons of artwork because most people can't read. So in order to evangelize people properly, you need to have lots of things with pictures. Well, that's another thing. Also, you're building a really big church, that's a massive jobs program.
Yep.
All right? Again, the church is the prime mover of the economy, so people would actually demand bigger churches that take longer to build. Mr. Bishop, why won't you build us a bigger church so that we can have the glassmakers will be paid, and the bricklayers, and the masons, and the people excavating stuff from the quarry. Right, so this is a big economic thing as well. The church is building more and more stuff. Yes.
The marketplaces then grow.
Yeah, the marketplace is now going to grow. If the church is spending money freely, then that's going to mean that the marketplace is going to grow. Stone quarry people are going to have work. Glass makers are going to have work. Blacksmiths are going to have work. It's a way of ensuring that you have lots of people being employed. So that's sort of there's an economic rationale here too. All right.
But they still have to come up with the money to do all this stuff too.
Yeah.
People were willing to do it, they wanted.
Yeah. And you have to remember that this is a time when, again, the Pope himself is the king of most of Italy. He's controlling large swaths of Italy. So you're much less dependent upon donations, right? Because what will happen is, okay, we just have, so like if you control most of cereal Italy, then you have big crops of stuff. These crops can then be used to sell to foreign countries for export. They can be used for consumption for import. You don't have to worry about donations. You're much more like self-sufficient. The church is much more self-sufficient in economic sense. Right? So, so you might say, well, where's the church getting its money from? Well, the church is getting its money from the lands it controls. The church owns land. The church owned farms and plantations, and monasteries were kind of like factories too. Like monasteries built stuff, right? Benedictines in England were doing primitive forms of steel work. So this is extreme. This is lots of value added right there. Okay. Any questions on the reformers' agenda here? Okay. So, okay. Does anybody have anyone particularly worried about this one here? So I know I did the Crusades talk last year, and everyone was kind of interested about this.
Got it.
You got it. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. So, papal acceptance of the reforms. This is sort of a list of key popes that are engaged in the Gregorian reforms. So, the first two popes that show some kind of inkling toward reforming inside the Beltway. So this is sort of, those are the people outside the Beltway. This is what they wanted to accomplish. This is how it happens. This is how the reforms get to inside the Beltway. The first two popes here that show any kind of inkling toward the Gregorian reformers, bringing the reform into Rome, is Pope Gregory V, who dies in 999, and Pope Sylvester II, who was Pope from 999 to 1003. Pope Gregory V reforms some of the, he doesn't do a whole lot with regard to the reforms, but he does reform some of the practices for electing subsequent popes. And he appoints several German bishops to be cardinals. To be sure, they're a minority of the cardinals, but now you've got German guys working down in Italy from the German reforms. He also appoints some Benedictines from Cluny to be cardinals. So now you go from having no reformers inside the Beltway to having a minority of the cardinals have significant reforming credentials under Pope Gregory V. Pope Sylvester II is the first French pope. Gerbert of Aurillac was his name. Pope Sylvester II, the first French pope. He's from Aurillac, which, anyone know their French geography? Where's Aurillac? No, okay. Aurillac is sort of down by the French-Spanish border. Gerbert, when he was a young man, he actually went to go study in the parts of Spain that were Muslim-run. Because in the Muslim world at this point, works of Plato and particularly Aristotle were in wide dissemination. So he went and studied actually in Muslim Spain to learn more about ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Greek science. He then goes back, and he is appointed by Otto's son to be a bishop in Germany. He then eventually becomes a cardinal and elected pope. Gerbert of Aurillac, 999 to 1003. So with Gerbert, what you're getting is the popes are starting to, some of the popes, you have a pope now that's kind of promoting the intellectual aspect of the Gregorian reform. You've got Sylvester II sort of saying that he is personally in support of the Gregorian reform, but there's a limit to sort of what he can do structurally. So Gregory V brings a few German guys down. Sylvester II, you now have a pope who is sort of, I'm personally in favor of the reform, but there's a limit to what I can do. So you fast forward a few years, and you have Pope St. Leo IX, 1049 to 1054. With Pope Leo IX, you now get the reformers in charge of things by the end of his reign. So when he starts, Pope Leo IX when Pope Leo IX starts, the reformers, the Benedictines and the Germans here, the German bishops here, are kind of in the minority in Italy in terms of the cardinal, in terms of what's going on in the Vatican. Pope St. Leo IX here was himself a German bishop before becoming pope. He then says, okay, the reformers are now going to be in charge of most things. And by the end of his reign, the reformers are now in charge of most things. You might notice here, he dies in 1054. What happened in 1054? Something about the Greeks. The Greek schism between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. So this is interesting. One of Pope St. Leo IX's last acts was, he said, Pope Leo IX says, okay, now that we've got the reformers in charge, we're reforming this, we're reforming this, we're reforming this, let's take the temperature of the guys in the Greek East. He sends Cardinal Humbert, German, over to Constantinople to assess the situation in Constantinople, to figure out what exactly is going on there in the Greek East, and try to convince them to work with them for reforms. Cardinal Humbert goes over there, and the Greek bishops will not give him the time of day. The Greek bishops accuse him of engaging in a political power grab in the Greek East, and that they don't have to listen to him. Cardinal Humbert says, no, you don't understand. You know, we're trying to work with you here. Cardinal Humbert then orders them to be excommunicated, and then the Greeks kick him out. What is interesting here is that the Greek response. The Greeks are apparently not aware at this time that in Italy you have reform going on. The Greeks think that what they're dealing with is those political faction popes in Italy, trying to extend their political influence into the Greek Empire, into the Byzantine Empire. And we already have problems with political factions over here in the Greek half of the empire, so why would we invite more Italian political factions over here? Come on. Cardinal Humbert is like, no, you don't understand. We're the reform guys. We don't trust you. Go away. Now, what's interesting here is that Cardinal Humbert pronounces the excommunication, but he pronounces the excommunication not knowing that Pope St. Leo IX has died.
Oops.
So, and during a papal interregnum, you continue on with your orders of the previous pope until your orders are rescinded. And Pope St. Leo IX had said, I want you to assess and take whatever action might be necessary to get them to work with us. So if he thinks Pope St. Leo IX is still alive, then his excommunication wouldn't have meant anything. His declaration would not have meant anything because the Pope just would have said, I don't agree to that, I rescind. So many people think that Cardinal Humbert was sort of using this as a tactic to try to get the Greeks to realize that they're actually the reform guy they should work with. The problem is, Pope St. Leo IX has died. So this excommunication actually stands. And then they go through a back and forth where like some popes rescind it, some popes put it back into force, some popes rescind it, some popes put it back in force. It becomes definitive in the 1400s. So yeah.
4 years.
So people often say the 1054 schism was definitive. No, it wasn't. In the 1400s, that's when it became definitive. So we then get to, second page here, Nicholas II, who is pope from 1058 to 61. He launches the most comprehensive papal election reform ever. He does, so so this is the English translation here, right? One of the things this does is he formalizes the conclave. He officially says the election must take place in a conclave. He places limits on what kind of cardinals are allowed to vote. Right? Under what conditions can somebody refuse to, let a cardinal vote? That's Nicholas II. Yeah, Nicholas II also, so Nicholas II launches the largest papal election reform ever. You know, banning soft money contributions and things like this. So Nicholas II here, he starts cracking down essentially on the spiritual stuff. He says, in order to be a cardinal, you know, you can be relieved of your cardinaling essentially if you're engaged in simony, if you're engaged in pluralism, if you're engaged in clerical concubinage. The Pope has the right to rescind your status as a cardinal. Right? You can be denied voting for the Pope if those things are in effect. Right. So then we get to the big one, big star, Pope Gregory VII, the man that this Gregorian reform movement is named after, subsequently. He's Pope from 1073 to 1085. Before becoming Pope, he was Cardinal Hildebrand, German. And and after him, there will actually not be another German Pope until Pope Benedict XVI. Yep. So, here's the deal. 1074. He issues a document saying that if you were engaged in simony or not keeping your vow of celibacy, you are excommunicated. 1075. He issues the Dictatus Papae. Not like Popeye, you know, in Spanish. Popeye, you know, Latin. This is a list of 27 statements that define the limits of papal authority. So saying this is what the Pope can do, this is what the Pope can do, and this is what governments are not allowed to do with regard to vis-a-vis church administration. So he lays this down, and you'll notice here, among these 27 things in the English translation, it's things like only the Pope has the authority to appoint bishops. Right? You can't, emperors cannot do this, kings cannot do this. Only he can use imperial insignia. Right? That he has the power to ordain a clerk of any church that he may wish. Right? The government has no right to block papal appointments, in other words. The Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, Scripture bearing witness. So it's a statement of papal infallibility. That the Roman Pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter and yada yada yada, as is contained in the decrees of St. Symmachus the Pope. Right, so basically, if the Pope is canonically ordained and, he discharges his office well, you may consider him to be a saint. There has never been a subsequent Pope that has actually confirmed that. So this is not actually a doctrinal document, this is a political document. Saying this is the limits of papal authority. Right? That he may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod. Right? He doesn't need a Congress to ratify his appointments. That he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. Right? That he can depose kings and princes if he wants to. Why not? He signed a treaty with Charlemagne saying that he could. Right. So here's what happens. Henry III's son, Henry IV, decides that he is going to appoint a new Archbishop of Milan. Milan, at this time, was part of the First German Empire. And this is something that Otto I and Henry III, people would have said, good, you're appointing those reform guys. Go ahead. Go ahead. Appoint another Benedictine to be in Milan. Gregory VII says, no, you can't do that. Right? Thank you once. We're glad that your father and your great-great-grandfather launched the Gregorian reform, but the reform is very much underway now, and that you've jump-started it, but it's time for you to remove yourself from the equation. Political authorities need to remove themselves from the equation. Right. Henry IV says, no, of course I can do this. Gregory VII excommunicates him and releases all of his subjects from their vows of obedience to him. Henry IV then faces revolts on a series of fronts by local princes and people who are afraid that if a ruler is excommunicated, that means he may not care that much about our souls. So he faces a series of revolts. So he's got a choice. He can either say, no, I'm not going to submit to Pope Gregory VII. I'm going to stay excommunicated, but then I'm going to have to raise a big army to go and like take down all these revolts that I'm facing. Or I can go and, make up with Gregory VII and the revolts will go away. Yes?
At that time, all those princesses and leaders and so forth, they did fear for their very souls if they sided with or against the church, right?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things here. Some historians say that yes, the princes here were actually concerned about this, right? Because most people at the time were. That being said, there are some other historians that say, this is also a political thing. If you're afraid that the German emperor and you're a local prince has all this authority, this is an opportunity for you to reduce the scope of the federal government of Germany to get more local autonomy, right? If I don't have to listen, I can't have to listen to that emperor, that emperor's excommunicated. But you know what? Your prince is not. Right, so it gives the local princes more power. So they could be legitimately concerned, or this could be a political power grab. So what happens is, Henry IV, rather than face these revolts, rather than have to raise an army and face these revolts, he finds out what castle Gregory VII is staying at for the winter. He rides horseback in penitent's clothing across the Alps. In the dead of winter, stands outside Canosa Castle and asks politely for the Pope to absolve him of his sins. Gregory VII absolves him of his sins, and he swears fealty to the Pope. And all the other people in Europe there, knowing how much Henry IV, the most powerful secular ruler in Germany here, had been essentially humiliated and had to repudiate his entire line of stuff, didn't want to be put in the same situation. So this is sort of the guy with the guns, or in this case the pikes, right? Who has all like the political power in Western Europe, has to go and beg absolution before a guy with nothing. He's got like a pen and a piece of paper, and maybe some advisors, right? There's no army there or anything like that. So after Gregory VII, right, pretty much most rulers in Europe are unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the Pope. Because what? You might face revolts. Face revolts, then that's bad. Right. So after Gregory VII, this sort of becomes called the Gregorian Reforms. After Gregory VII, there's this view, most people, if you read documents from the time after Pope Gregory VII's reign, what you get is people talking about how all of Western Europe is one country called Christendom, and each little kingdom is like a state or a province of this larger empire, with the Pope being the head of state. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's how most people from the 10, 11, and 1200s see Western Europe. They see it as one country called Christendom, where the Pope is the head of state, essentially, and then all these kingdoms are sort of like provinces of Christendom. Because in practice, that's kind of how it's operating. I mean, the Pope's not enforcing stuff. I mean, he can say, if you don't do this, I'll excommunicate you. You want to take that risk? Right? Okay, I want you to do this. I don't want to do that. Okay, well, I'll lay you under interdict. All the clergy are going to go on strike. The clergy go on strike, how are people going to get the sacraments? Can't get the sacraments, can't be saved. Right? The clergy, the church here is the largest place for education, healthcare, and the economy. If the clergy go on strike, your economy goes in the tank, there's no tax revenue, there's no education, there's no healthcare. You want to take that chance? No. Yeah.
But again, if you were excommunicated, your damnation was assured unless you were reconciled.
The idea is that if you're excommunicated and you stay excommunicated, your only hope is that that Pope unjustly excommunicated you, and only God would know that, right? So you can either become reconciled, or you can take the chance the Pope was mistaken when he excommunicated you, and hope that you know God will save you on your deathbed, right? Okay. So after this, Pope Urban II says, you know what? I think we're stable enough to mount a coherent strategy to defend against Muslim attacks. So Urban II here launches the First Crusade, and again. Here for the Crusades class last year, I gave sort of his 6 rationales for why they need to go on crusade. You know, I sort of showed how like you see very similar arguments being made in like the United States in the last 100 years, so it's not like it's anything spectacular. You know, the Byzantines want a second front against Muslim attacks. Aren't we going to help out our brother Christians? These poor people are being oppressed. We have humanitarian reasons. These Christians are being forced to convert or die. Shouldn't we go and help these people? Those political popes, those Italian political faction popes, they didn't care about those guys. We care about those guys. You know, those Muslims, they're preventing us from using trade routes into India and China that we always were able to use before. You know, things like that. They're preventing us from going on pilgrimage. Urban II. Now, the height of the Gregorian Reform movement is Innocent III in the early 1200s. Innocent III is once again the one that opens up the Inquisition, but again, the Inquisition in its original intended purpose, humanitarian intended purpose. And Innocent III, if you know Robin Hood, King John, right? King John is happening essentially during the time of Innocent III, right? So why was King John so unpopular? Well, King John was excommunicated by Pope Innocent III for taxing the clergy too much. And you know what? King John would not, you know, say he was sorry to the Pope. So England was laid under interdict. And the king was so unfeeling to the common man that he was not able to reconcile with the Pope so that the common man could receive services from the church, and also King John put their souls on the line. Right. So King John here, one of the reasons, so like with King John, one of the things with John, why is the Magna Carta signed in 1215? Because the barons are so upset that he went head-to-head with the Pope, you know, and lost in the early, you know, lost at the beginning of his reign. And now they're going back and they're, you know, saying, King John not going to do that again. There are limits what the king can do. That's one of the reasons why in the king's coronation oath to this very day, Magna Carta says you have to swear to protect the rights of the church. Because if you don't, the Pope gets excommunicated. People get upset, revolts. The age of the Gregorian Reform ends with Pope Boniface VIII, who spoke from 1294 to 303. And he has a big conflict with King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, or Philip the Handsome. What happens is that there's an issue. Philip IV wants more autonomy for France, for the French church. He wants the King of France to be able to appoint bishops and things like this. Huh. It's like the same thing that the King Henry IV tried to do. Boniface VIII says, really, you want to go there? Want to go there? He says, yes, I want a replay of this. Let's see what happens. Boniface VIII excommunicates Philip IV of France. Philip IV of France sends his troops down into Italy to interrogate Boniface VIII. He then dies after the interrogation. The conclave meets. Pope. The Pope is roughed up by so Boniface, well, you know, in his 80s, he's harshly interrogated by the agents of the French king. Boniface dies. The cardinals meet. Philip IV says, you can expect similar treatment from me until you elect somebody who's going to be more compromising, more balanced approach. And what eventually happens over the course of the 1300s, the cardinals then capitulate to Philip IV here. And what ends up happening is over the course of the 1300s, each of these parts of the Gregorian reforms are slowly undone by different kings, requiring the cardinals to make different concessions to them. And then you're back where you were in the 8, 9, and early 1000s, with the same kind of simony, clerical concubinage, pluralism issues that you had in the 8 and 900s. And then you get Martin Luther this time.